be talking about native plants for Muskoka Gardens. And why I kind of preface that with like Muskoka Gardens is that we moved here about 10 years ago. And one characteristic that I found with most um, all Muskoka gardeners is that it was really hard to garden up here. We have pretty nutrient poor soil. So it's often really sandy. We often have like really shallow soil with our bedrock. So we're sometimes not working with a lot. It can often be wet. We obviously are lucky to live where we live, and there's a lot of lakes, but with that comes a lot of high water levels, shorelines, wetlands. So it's typically not the most ideal conditions for like traditional garden plants and traditional gardening. Um, so what we like to do is kind of like categorize all these plants and into those sections. So that's kind of what this presentation will go through, is just dividing those hard to grow areas up and then suggesting plants that'll grow there. Obviously, it's a really short list. Um, it's really hard to kind of pick like, your top 10 plants when there's so many to choose from. So we try to consider like availability and like, how long it blooms and if it's, kind of ticks a few more boxes. Um, okay, so we'll get going. So, like I said, there might be a little bit of crossover with next week's webinar if you're joining us for that as well. So next week's webinar is gardening for wildlife. So this one is more kind of plant focused, and the next one is kind of like more wildlife focused, obviously. But I did want to do some kind of like background information on like what exactly a native plant is. So obviously it's a plant that's kind of lived here in a certain location for a really long time. Typically we've always kind of thought of that as being prior to colonialization, right? So like that's essentially when we had the biggest impact on our ecosystems is when we started bringing plants over from Europe and from Asia. So that used to kind of be a bit of a definition for a long time as to like what made a plant native. Now we take a much more kind of like holistic approach of like really what matters is the relationship that plant has in the ecosystem. Um, and so plants that have co-evolved with other species. So, for me, the Ecological Landscape Association definition kind of covers everything. It says native plants are uncultivated flora, indigenous. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. It's a good one too, but a native plant is one that is evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. So obviously those relationships take, hundreds, thousands of years, if not millennia, if they've been here that long. Something that's been here since the 1600s, 1700s at most, isn't going to have those relationships with other insects, songbirds, wildlife. Like I said, we do get into this a lot more in the Gardening for Wildlife webinar. You can kind of think of those relationships as like, the monarch and the milkweed evolving together. Um, but that's kind of like a background as to like what a native plant is. And what also is relevant is native to where. So for us in Muskoka, any plant that's native to Ontario, any plant that's native to Muskoka is going to be native to Ontario. But a plant that's native to Canada doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be native to Ontario or Muskoka. Um, so it's obviously maybe not going to have the same kind of relationships. We at Hidden Habitat will often grow plants that aren't actually native to Muskoka, the bio district. A perfect example of that is butterfly milkweed. It's got that beautiful orange flowers. We use it a lot of in our landscape designs because it does support the monarch butterfly. It stays put. It's a true perennial, and it doesn't like move around and cause a little bit of garden chaos, much like the common milkweed. So it's not actually native to Muskoka, but it functions ecologically here. So it still supports the monarch caterpillar because obviously they still migrate up here. So it's things like that. So that's important to consider. You don't necessarily have to follow like all the, the true rules, and it's you can get really into the weeds sometimes as to like, if you are landscaping and it's supposed to be wet meadow, then obviously there's a lot of plants that aren't going to be suited or indigenous to that area. But that really kind of takes it out of the realm in gardening and puts it more into like restoration or conservation work. Another consideration for native plants is we kind of sometimes think of them as all being equal. And oh, I don't know if the screen just stopped sharing. There we go. And they're actually not. So depending on what you want out of them. So for a lot of people, I find they really move towards native gardening for two reasons. Either to support wildlife, or for that like low maintenance kind of aspect. The gardening for wildlife or like supporting pollinators or songbirds is really, I find, at the heart of like why a lot of native plant gardeners choose native plants. So that's kind of why we say they're not necessarily all created equal. There's some that are considered like keystone species. So some will support more moths and butterflies, like oak trees, the family of oaks, not like a singular species. But Quercus, the family, can support upwards of 500 different species of caterpillars. And so willows, it's like 400 species. And our wild native cherries, um, again, it's like, I think 200 or 300 different species of moths and butterflies. So um, it's kind of, for us, it's important to kind of like know why you're doing it and what you really want to support if gardening for wildlife is one of your reasons. And again, if it is, then I would suggest that you join us for next week's webinar because we get more into that as well. And then sometimes what's considered a native plant isn't. So we have wildflowers, and essentially all native plants are wildflowers, but all wildflowers aren't native plants. We have tons of stuff that grow along our roadsides and trail sides that are beautiful, but often they're not native and they can be invasive species. So really kind of being aware of just because it's growing out in the wild and it's naturalized doesn't necessarily mean that it's a native plant, especially, if you're someone that's going to be ambitious enough to like collect seeds and grow something from seed, to really know what you're growing so that you're not spreading an invasive species. And so these are just some examples of some wildflowers. Dame's rocket, viper's bugloss, chicory is another one. And then nativars. So they're just native species like echinaceas and ninebarks that have been cultivated to have different characteristics. So, we've taken a purple coneflower and made it with white petals, or a ninebark Diablo, um, a nice menacing name, and given it purple leaves. So, again, we always preface it depends why you're growing these species. If it's purely just for aesthetics, it really fits a color palette you're looking for in your garden or height or something like that, then by all means, these plants aren't invasive. They're not doing harm. Um, but if you are wanting to support pollinators or wildlife, we do recommend choosing a pure native species. That's because often we don't know what the result is of when we make the cultivated species. how that impacts the relationship. For example, um, you can imagine like changing the leaves of a Diablo of a nine bark into like a dark purple is going to very much change the chemistry of the plant. So it's obviously going to change how it looks and how it tastes. So all of the insects that have kind of evolved with this plant to be either a food source or a host plant isn't probably going to use a nine bark Diablo. Whereas perhaps, a white echinacea is still going to function in the same way. Um, but there's a little bit of research on that, and a lot of the time, um, as long as like you're not changing the floral like actual physiology of it, so like there's no double petals or anything kind of weird like that, there isn't usually a huge impact. And so, like I said, we often come to native plant gardening because we want to support wildlife. And then there's also, it can be the benefit of it being like low maintenance. And that's often really touted as like a big benefit. And I always try to say there's a caveat. Native plants aren't anymore low maintenance than any other plant. Really, when you're gardening with native plants, what you're taking advantage of is like biological evolution, right? So you're just planting that relationship, and that's what you're really taking advantage of. So if you put black-eyed Susan in partly shaded, kind of like wet-ish, seasonally damp, loamy area, it's not gonna like it there. It's gonna be super unhappy and not thrive. So it's not gonna be low maintenance in the sense that you're gonna have to probably tend to it or replace it. Whereas if you plant it in somewhere that's full sun, nutrient poor soil, sandy, gravelly, medium soil, it will thrive. You won't have to water it once it's established, because those are the characteristics that it likes to grow in. So you really want to make sure you have the right plant for the right place and consider the light conditions, soil type, and moisture availability. And I do always say once the plant is established, which can take anywhere from like 2 weeks to like a month, you shouldn't have to water it. I know some people still do in like heat stress during July and August, but typically the plants will should be able to endure that. And even if they go wilty or even die back a little, it's not going to kill them. That they will be able to come back. Um, and unfortunately, with native plants, you still have to weed. Especially when we first plant stuff, we tend to disturb all the soil and awaken that seed bank that's in there, and things pop out of nowhere. Um, if you, you know, choose plants that spread quickly, then obviously weeding will be less. But yeah, weeding will never stop. So, like I kind of said in the beginning of the presentation, when we moved here about 10 years ago, we set up our nursery. And one of the things I found is that people weren't coming to the nursery to buy like a specific plant. They weren't saying, oh, like I really want like a yellow plant that's like this tall and a foot tall. Um, they were coming to the nursery saying like, oh, there's this spot, in our backyard that's like shallow soil, like it's on bedrock, it's full baking sun all summer. Nothing will grow there. Is there anything that'll grow there? Or we have a lot of trees because it's Muskoka, and it's sandy soil, it's gravelly soil, so it's dry shade. Is there anything that we can plant in that? And then, of course, shorelines where it's seasonally can be flooded, so plants can be, in water for, a month on either end of the season. So they essentially a lot of people were coming with a problem, and that's kind of um, what we like to do is like to offer some solutions. And it's great that, we can take advantage of native plants to like solve those problem areas. Um, so if you don't know you have a problem, which, would be great. Even if you have an area that's like forested or shoreline, or it's, perhaps it's under a Norway maple or something. It's always best to know exactly what kind of conditions you're working with. It helps with plant selection. So light conditions is usually the first one people go to when you're trying to figure out plants. And so you often see like full sun, full shade, and then either part sun or part shade. And I do find that part sun and part shade can sometimes be used interchangeably um, in a lot of like garden centers, nurseries, forums, blogs, Facebook, the internet. Um, so it's nice to kind of gather a few resources, check a couple of their different sites to see, how that plant does, because some plants might be okay in part sun, but not in part shade. And then we have our moisture conditions. So we do have a lot of dry soil in Muskoka. Like on our property, it's like beach sand. Everything drains pretty quick, and then we kind of have like a clay pan underneath it. Um, and then if medium soil, it tends to have more organic component to it, so it holds in the moisture a little bit better. So as the water's kind of filtering through, it's not draining through quickly. You can kind of imagine if you're like had a bucket with some holes in it and it was just sand, and if you poured water through it, it would just kind of come through almost like a shower. Whereas if you fill that bucket with like sphagnum moss or something, it's going to absorb it like a sponge. So it's kind of two ends of the spectrum. But that's kind of how you can think about like how soil, organic matter can help with improving your moisture conditions. And then for those that have clay, it's, in my opinion, the worst conditions because you get wet and dry. So clay essentially doesn't allow water to go through because it makes like this impervious and penetratable kind of like deadpan situation where the water will just rush right off. Um, or if it's like in a low point and we've had a lot of rain, it can also just sit on top. So the water is not draining through and being absorbed by the ground. So it can either be really wet or really dry. So there are plants that grow in clay. Um, we'll get into that. I will say this from having seen people that have done this and have regretted it is to never add sand to your clay soil because what you get is essentially is harder clay like a concrete. You just want to keep adding like organic matter. So like feed from the top, like mulch, wood chips, and that will eventually improve the soil health. And so yeah, soil type, you can do the soil test. So you just kind of like pick it up in your hand. Um, and if it's kind of like rolls between your thumb and forefinger into a little ball. With clay soil, it'll, stick pretty much like a little marble. Sandy soil, it'll kind of like fall apart. And loamy soil, it'll kind of like stay together. But if you kind of like poke it or drop it, it's gonna fall apart. So traditionally, we've always treated loamy soil as like the ideal preferred soil. I do always say to gardeners that, whatever conditions you're dealing with, there's plants for you. So if you have really sandy soil, there are a lot of really great plants that you can choose. So you don't have to keep striving for like the loamy soil. Okay, so we're gonna get into the plants. Um, So, like I said before, it was really hard to kind of narrow it down to like 12 species. So for us, we kind of picked a diversity of just different colors, different heights, different textures, bloom time. Yeah, so you could kind of take these 12, put them in a garden, and you would have color at different years, different textures. By all means, there's a lot more if you're looking for anything above and beyond this list. So a lot of you are going to already be familiar with a lot of these species because they're kind of iconic Muskoka species. So like the blue flag iris, um, is I'm sure everyone's really familiar with it. I think someone was asking earlier about a ground cover. So this is Canada anemone. It's nice white flowers in the spring and it spreads really easily. Cardinal flower, which is known for attracting hummingbirds. And it actually does. We see them quite a bit at our place. So I always took that with a grain of salt for a long time until I saw it with my own eyes. So it's true. Flat-topped aster. It's one of my favorite kind of shoreline or plants that like wet feet because it's so tall. It can get upwards of 5 feet and then just has this beautiful kind of like big showy white flower. It looks great at the back of a garden or if you're doing something like really tall. It's really quite pretty. Another one we use a lot of is the common rush. So it's great along shorelines or ponds, or if you're wanting to have a bit of like structure and texture, while keeping it like a small height. Common rush is nice because it's somewhat evergreen. It looks like a grass, but it's a rush. So its stalks are like almost like little straws. They're like hollow little tubes that are quite thick. So it's quite a sturdy plant. It doesn't fall down and flop. It kind of like stays where it is. And it looks great along the shoreline. It's kind of gives you that grass type look. Um, Blue vervain is another nice tall plant with like the little purple spikes, another kind of common Muskoka species. Swamp milkweed, definitely a popular one because it is, supports the monarch butterfly and is like a very vibrant pink. It is a darker pink than the common milkweed. One of our favorites, I feel like I say that all the time, but this one really is bottle gentian. Because if anyone's ever grown this, by far the benefit of growing it is not the flower, although it's beautiful, is because bumblebees are the only ones that can pollinate it. So as you can see, the flower is like a little closed tube. So they have to actually open the flower with their little tiny bumblebee legs and stick their whole body into the flower to pollinate it. And they're the only ones strong enough to, because the flowers are quite robust. So often what you see are these big bumblebees, trying to open up this flower, and you see these little bee butts kind of buzzing in and out of the flower. And it's just the cutest little thing. So, if you're the type of person that likes to, sit in your garden and watch bees, for sure, bottle gentian is great. And I would also say the same for turtle head, which is number 10. Um, the flower is like a similar shape. It's not quite closed, but the bumblebees will kind of like stick their whole body in there and stick their butts out. It's great. And number 9, not to pass it over, is purple stemmed aster. Similar to like a New England aster, it's just the petals are more purpley blue than like a pinky purple. And I find it's just a more common species in Muskoka. It's one we grow here. So I like to include it. Looks great in the fall with like um, the flat-topped aster and the grass-sleeved goldenrod, which is number 11, which is not a goldenrod at all. It just has yellow flowers. So it looks like a goldenrod from a distance, but it has that like open face flower similar to like Joe Pye weed or the flat-topped aster. And it has nice kind of like nice foliage as well. So for people, for some reason, if you don't like goldenrod, grass leaf goldenrod is a great addition. And then Joe Pye weed, which is um, definitely, I feel like it's a must-have if you have a wet area, just because it is such a robust plant. It does so well. It offers so much color. Pollinators love it. Um, and yeah, it's a great kind of like pinky purple color. And even the leaves and the stalks on it can be quite pretty. And so for shrubs for shorelines, I find often when we're doing projects that involve water, people really want to keep them short so it doesn't impede the view. So some of those shorter species, I'm going to go out of number here. So the spireas, so number one, number three, and number eight. Sweet Gale. So those are usually the ones we recommend if you don't want anything that grows over, say, like 3 to 4 feet. They're nice short shrubs. The spireas obviously have nice color to them, either white or pink. The Sweet Gale is not a very showy shrub, so that's its flower there. It's kind of like a bit of a greeny yellow flower. But it does offer a nice foliage and it actually has a nice fragrance to it as well. If you brush past it or if, you catch the wind of it, it's very savory, like rosemary or something like that. And it's great at creating a lot of like texture, especially if you want shoreline erosion control or like geese abatement. Like, it hides your grass if you have grass. The geese can't see it because it's such a nice dense shrub. Um, so other species are obviously elderberry, high bush cranberry. Um, those ones I find most people are pretty familiar with. They are edible. They do get quite large, and I find they look best when they're given the space. So, but when you kind of cram it into a space against everything, um, they can look all right, but you give elderberry like it's, 6 feet space and it can really fill out. It's quite stunning. Um, and buttonbush, which I find a lot of people aren't too familiar with it, although it's a pretty common species along our shorelines here. And it's just a cool, funky plant because it's got these big white spiky balls as flowers. It tends to sucker up on shorelines, so usually when you see it, it's like a big swath of it. This one is nice as well if you are really trying to protect your shoreline. And you can prune this back. So it does typically, without maintenance, get like upwards of 6 feet tall, but you can cut it back to keep it like 3 to 4 feet. And it doesn't seem to mind it so much. And it's a pollinator magnet as well, buttonbush. It is terrific. A lot of our small native mason bees absolutely love this thing. Um, our wild rose, the swamp rose. It is quite thorny, so if you have deer issues, this is a great one. Same with sweet gale because it's fragrant. And red osier dogwood, which I feel most people are familiar with because we see it so frequently um, in regular garden centers. Same with like pussy willow, which we included it here as a shrub. It does get to be a full-size tree, but you can kind of maintain it as a shrub, a large shrub. But left going, it can get upwards of like 20 feet. But I do always remind people that pussy willows and all willows are dioecious, meaning that the one plant is female and one plant is male. And depending on where you get your tree, you might have the male, and therefore you might not get the little gray fuzzy cat feet on them. So we've had a few people, I think, disappointed before. They've just gone out and harvested pussy willows and realized they probably got the males. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick water break. So on the rocks, it's typically like, a rock alvar or rock barrens, like the Torrens Barrens or the Kashi Barrens. You can think of that kind of landscape where it's like bedrock, really thin soil, baking hot sun. You would think that this would be a hard landscape, that nothing would grow there. But because we have that kind of landscape throughout Ontario. So we have the barrens of, Muskoka and beyond. And then south of us, we do have the alvars, like Cardin alvar, which is limestone. Some of these species are typically found in alvars, but grow quite fine. So they don't need that like basic limestone soil. They'll thrive in our kind of little bit more acidic soil. So these are all our go-tos. One thing I do find is that if you're dealing with shallow soil, it's hard to get tall plants. It's hard to get height. And that's, you can think of like a root base. It's not going to be able to like anchor some of these taller plants in there. The real exception is perhaps something like wild bergamot, which you can get like 3 feet out of. And it tends to be pretty happy because they will sucker out and kind of anchor themselves vertically. So prairie smoke is a really popular one because it's starting to flower now. So it's nice to have that little bit of color, and it's kind of like a funky plant. So that little puff of pink smoke that people know it by is it actually, forming its seed head. So it's at the very end of those little um, hairy things is its seed. So it's kind of neat. Black-eyed Susan, I'm sure we're all familiar with black-eyed Susans. If you're not, well then, you came to the right place to learn. Lance leaf coreopsis. Um, we use this one a lot because it can flower for a really long time if you deadhead it. So you don't even have to be fancy. We can sometimes just take our trimmer and like run it over with a trimmer. Um, and it'll flower again pretty much like June to September. So it is nice to include that because you get kind of color all year. Field pussy toes is a great one. It's a ground cover. So the plant itself usually only gets like a couple inches and then it sends out that flower stalk that looks like the pad of a cat's foot, um, kind of late spring. It's actually the host plant for the American painted butterfly as well. So if you do want to support pollinators, this is a great addition. Wild strawberry, which I find you either love or hate. I definitely love it. I love to include it. We have it growing everywhere and it flowers so early, like it's flowering now on our property when a lot of things aren't. So you get that early flush of like white, and we tend to use this as ground cover in a lot of our garden beds instead of like applying wood chip or mulch. Um, we just use wild strawberry, and it's nice because you get little pops of color. Harebell is another actually Muskoka species that you'll find in a lot of the barrens. So the Torrance Barrens has that species up there. So it's a neat plant in that it can tolerate shallow soil, wet, like, the seasonal flooding that'll happen sometimes in those landscapes. So it's pretty versatile. It blooms whenever it wants, which I kind of like. It's kind of like, a bit of a rock star that way. It'll bloom June to September, but not continuously, just whenever the conditions suit it, which is kind of neat. And then it also has two different types of foliage, which I think is cool. It has its basal foliage, which is kind of like lobed and round, and then it has like grass-like foliage. So it's a very beautiful, kind of delicate, nice plant. Um, Hairy beer tongue is similar, grows in similar landscapes actually to our black-eyed Susan. You see it sometimes in like rock barrens. It's if people might know its cousin, foxglove beer tongue, very similar. This hairy beer tongue is shorter, so it's only about 2 feet tall, and it's pink, but really drought tolerant. And same with gray goldenrod, nice small um, goldenrod. And the leaves are more fleshy, and they tend to hold their color a lot longer. They don't brown and kind of die back like some goldenrods. But gray goldenrod's only about a foot or two, which is nice. It's a nice short, small little goldenrod. Um, and then wild columbine, which I'm sure we're kind of all familiar with. Those, I guess it looks like a bit of a jester's hat. One that I find most people aren't familiar with is upland white goldenrod. I have no idea how it's considered a goldenrod, but it is. It's a solidago. It's white. It has open aster-like flowers. I don't know who decides this, but it is stunning. It flowers really late. Like we've had it blooming still in November with snow on the ground. Um, and it's the same height as like a lot of these in this list. It's about a foot or two. And then bearberry, which is a nice evergreen ground cover. Deer do like it though, so if you have a deer issue, watch out for bearberry because they'll probably eat it when you're not looking. And then, so our shady areas. This is probably the biggest ask that I get is, what can I grow under my acidic white pine in Muskoka in the sand? And I always say, well, your soil is acidic, but it's not because of the white pine. Your soil is acidic because of our granite bedrock. Um, so it's actually the soil that makes it acidic, and the white pines typically like that and tend to grow here. Um, when the needles actually fall, by the time they've turned brown and kind of fallen onto the ground, they're neutral. So pine needles don't make your soil acidic. They make great compost. Like we, for the most part, leave our needles in the garden. It'll decompose eventually. It takes obviously a lot longer than most other things, but we leave it. It's great organic matter. Anyway, that's a little aside. So some perennials. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Trillium already, and Hepatica is a nice ephemeral. It blooms early, so it would be blooming now. So ephemeral meaning that it flowers and leaves out, and then the plant completely dies back. So if you are planting an ephemeral, it's nice to kind of pair that with something else that'll fill the space. So like blue stem goldenrod or zigzag goldenrod, so that you don't have an empty space in the garden. Wild blue phlox, which is a nice ground cover. It's become really popular in the last few years. Bunchberry, which we've included the red berries in this photo, but you probably know it by its white flower. Very common, great, great ground cover. Um, yeah, and then a fun fact about it is just the seeds actually project out like a gunshot almost like jewelweed. So it's kind of a neat little plant. Um, Bloodroot is another ephemeral. So I do find that with shade, there's usually a lot of like springtime flowers, and that's because the leaves haven't filled the space often, so you're getting more sun in the spring. There's a reason for that. But there are some that provide fall color. So heartleaf aster, Lindley's aster, that's not on here, large leaf aster. So there are some woodland asters that'll do that. It's same with goldenrods. So blue stem goldenrod and zigzag goldenrod are some shade loving goldenrods. And then dry shade. So, 1 to 5, uh, hardleaf aster will actually probably tolerate some pretty good dry shade, but definitely like trilliums don't really like dry shade as much. Um, so wild geranium's great. It'll spread as a ground cover, so through rhizomes, and it gets a nice pink flower. I would say like June. Um, Pairs wonderfully with foam flower, which has a nice kind of like white bottle brush flower. Also has like a same kind of growth habit where it kind of like spreads out and fills a whole space nicely. Blue stemmed goldenrod, it's really stunning. The yellow flowers work down the stem, kind of like a bridal wreath. So you kind of think of it as like a bridal wreath goldenrod. And it gets quite wide. It doesn't get very tall, like 2 to 3 feet tall, but it can get upwards of like 3 to 4 feet wide. So it just kind of like arches out. Um, and then wild columbine can work in some shade, kind of like filtered part shade. And Christmas fern. So there's always tons of ferns. We didn't include a lot of ferns because I feel like as Muskoka gardeners, we know ferns work in shade. What I did want to include was Christmas fern because it's one of the ferns that'll grow in dry shade, which is nice. And then foxglove beard tongue. It's nice for getting a little bit late color, so it usually flowers in June. Um, if it's like deep, deep shade, then they're probably not going to get the blooms out of it. But in a part shade garden, it'll look nice. And then some shrubs for shade. We have a lot of really beautiful native viburnums in Ontario, specifically even in just Muskoka. So, hobblebush, nannyberry, highbush cranberry, maple leaf viburnum, wild raisin. Um, I'm sure I'm missing some. They all typically have white flowers with blueberries, um, some fall color. What you're usually getting is difference in height. So, nanny berry is going to be quite large, like 8 feet tall. Hobblebush, the same, except it kind of grows out. I don't know if you've ever come across it walking in the woods up here, but it's called hobblebush because it kind of grows out and like trips people. So then they, are hobbling for the rest of their trip, I suppose, through the forest, because it kind of suckers along the forest floor. So it has a neat kind of growth habit to it. Arrowwood, that's the one I was missing. But arrowwood is kind of a go-to one for us because it has a pretty like compact form. So it's like about 6 feet mature height. It doesn't get too wide. Yeah, it's nice fall color as well. And it's pretty tolerant of like dry to moist soil conditions. And then if you're wanting something a bit shorter, then the maple leaf viburnum is nice because it typically gets about 4 feet tall. And some other species, again, there's so much to choose from. But witch hazel for, getting that funky kind of different flower in early spring. Red elderberry. So this one's not edible, but has a very similar kind of color and look than the black or Canada elderberry. And purple flowering raspberry. This one is a prolific grower. It can be a little aggressive. So usually for like naturalization projects or you're looking to fill a large space, it can be really nice because it is tolerant of like um, poor growing conditions. And then you also get a nice bright pink color out of it. And then our Canada yew. Some people call it dwarf hemlock or Canada hemlock. It's actually a yew. It's not a hemlock. But I guess it kind of looks like a hemlock. Um, but it's nice to get a small evergreen. There's not, I think it's the only one that I can think of that's a native evergreen that's shade tolerant, that's like a shrub that's short. So they're not very common. We are starting to grow it now, but it's not available yet. And so then these are the species that are kind of like they'll almost grow in a variety of conditions. So I call them jack of all trades. So if you don't know your condition, or for a lot of the time, people, when they're landscaping, you want repetition. So you want a little bit of consistency of that color. You don't want like, uh, a little patch of Oswego tea here and then like you never see it again, because it's nice to have that consistency throughout the whole space. It kind of lends to it being like well designed, intentional. So if you know that you have a yard that's full sun to part shade, then these are kind of some plants that you can kind of fit in like a larger context. Um, and I think the only one that I think we didn't talk about was um, our black chokeberry. I actually called it choke cherry. I just realized that. It's not a choke cherry, it's black chokeberry, Aronia melancarpa. Um, and it's a beautiful little shrub. It gets about like 4 or 5 feet tall. Nice white flowers in the spring, blueberries in the fall color. It'll tolerate full sun, kind of like part shade. And another shrub we didn't talk about was nine bark, which is the one that looks like it has little pink flowers on it on the bottom right, and that's nine bark seed heads. So it's stunning. This is actually a plant on our property. I guess all the pictures kind of are. Um, but every year it's breathtaking. That bright pink, and I didn't edit the photo. That's how pink it is. So it's absolutely beautiful. So you get the white flowers in the spring, and then the seed heads are like this bright pink. Um, so yeah, so these are kind of some that'll kind of tolerate um, big pictures. And then I already kind of spoke to it a little about like, when you're designing, um, what to consider. It's nice to have that repetition. It's always nice to plant in larger groups. Um, One thing I always advise people, it always gets a laugh, is like the mullet gardening technique. And this is more for like wildlife gardeners that kind of want it to be like a little naturalized, but don't want to kind of like piss off the neighbors or like be perceived as lazy, or any of those like negative connotations. So we always say you can keep it clean up the front, and then slowly it can be like messier at the back. And so a clean and intentional border, it always speaks to the space being intended. So even if you did like a border of like grasses or something like that. And these are just some designs that we've done in the past. And it's pretty much to show that, like, when you garden with native plants, it's really the same as gardening with like traditional plants. Um, you still want to follow the same rules and include, large groupings, a mix of like grasses and perennials and shrubs and um, you know, it's you're essentially just using native plants instead of traditional garden center plants. And you can also have a lot more fun with it sometimes. This was a backyard, so the middle island was a bit more um, like a meadow with a path around it. And so for maintenance, like I said before, you really want to make sure that, if you're wanting low maintenance, to pick the right plant. Um, I feel like, obviously we all know if you want to garden for wildlife, to ditch the pesticides, the herbicides, the fertilizers, even the pesticides, or herbicides that are organic or um, targeted at only certain species, I would take with a grain of salt. Um, Often I feel like that's complete either lies or misinformation. That often when we're killing one species, we're killing many other things too. Um, and we get into a lot of this stuff in the next webinar as well. Um, on like whether or not you should like rake the leaves and that kind of stuff. Um, Essentially, we always say it's really up to you. But the less you do, the better for wildlife, kind of thing. And see, so these are some photos of gardens that we've planted over the years. The bottom one is actually in Gravenhurst. She's a wonderful customer. Um, and it's just to kind of show that like, some of them were done, the photos were taken the day of planting, so the plants always look really quite small. So it's always nice when I can actually get back and take mature photos. Um, Essentially that, native plants can be really beautiful. They don't have to be like a messy, wild, weedy um, garden. It can still kind of really be a breathtaking space. So that is the presentation. I'll leave this up for a little bit. Like I said before, um, I have been recording it, and everyone that's registered will receive the recording. But by all means, I if you have bigger questions that you don't want to get into today, shoot me off an email or a phone call. Um, and we can get into it later, recognizing that I might be a little bit late getting back to you just because we're so busy. So I just kind of want to open the floor to see if people have questions. So you can either turn off your mic and speak up, raise your hand, or put it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. Someone asked about serviceberry. Serviceberry is a great tree. So, like I said, there's so many to choose from. It was hard to like leave some out of the list. Um, Serviceberry will grow pretty much like full sun to part shade. It's really tolerant of different soil conditions too. And then you get the berries and the fall color as well, which is nice. Apparently a beaver ate it though. We actually had a beaver take down a white pine. So I think if they're hungry, they'll eat anything. Someone's looking for a ground cover that can be placed over an existing septic bed. We do a lot of work on septic beds. We always preface that with making sure they get permission or not necessarily permission, but you want to check in with your septic place provider because sometimes they'll stipulate that it can only be grass or sod or lawn, and that if you put plants in there, that they're gonna not honor their guarantee. So that being said, plants for over a septic bed, anything that on the shallow soil, like on the rocks list, would work on a septic bed because they're shallow rooted plants. That's assuming you have full sun. So if you have shade, then it's a little different. You can go with some of the ephemerals, some ferns obviously don't have like very large root bases. Wild strawberry for sure is something that we always include on septic beds too. Um, Someone said they planted a swamp rose by the lake and it's suckered into their lawn. So yeah, it is our native roses are very much like that stereotypical what you think of like a rambling rose. So they do often need a lot of space and they will sucker really easily. So Yeah, you really want to be thoughtful about where you're putting it to make sure it's not necessarily near where you're walking. All right, well, I think that's all the questions that were in the chat. So, like I said, if people have other questions that they want to share with me later, by all means, I can you can left my email in the on the slide. You can email us. Thank you for joining us. And like I said, next week we have gardening for wildlife. Same time, so Wednesday at 7 p.m. Even if you want to register and you're not able to attend, we can send out the link to you. So thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Take care. Have a good night, everyone.